newcomer from HP with us, Roland Osae-Oppong, who is the North American digital marketing lead. But he's going to talk to us especially about a project that they've been embarking on, which really moves them into a different model, and that is a subscription model, the Instant Ink subscription plan, and the ways in which they had to have a media plan that targeted very specific audiences across all online and offline channels, and then figure out how to measure that. Last click attribution clearly wasn't going to work, so they started moving into an MTA approach. And Roland is going to explain to us not only what they did, but what they found, some lessons that he got that have come from this and the way they've tried to build a multi-touch attribution system from it. And then I'm going to come up and plague him with a few of my own reporter questions. Please welcome Roland.
Thank you very much for the kind intro, Steve. All right, so as we all know, the digital cookies upon us, right? And it's affecting everyone. At HP, launching our Instant Ink campaign, we needed to develop a measurement plan that was going to develop an accurate picture of the impact of media in the market. Basically, we invest in money. We want to know where our money is going and what it's doing for us, right? From online to offline to search to display, and then out of the box is what we also call it, right? When you buy a printer, you can get out of the box. So, as Steve said, I'm going to talk about our MTA plan because last touch is out the window now. And even with multi-touch, it was cookie-based, and so that was very limiting for us. Click this. There we go. All right, so right here, what I try to do is just set up a quick definition of what we're doing before, right? So during the journey, we identified that these are the various touch points that occur before the consumer converts, right? So it could be an exposure to CTV first, then to display, and then they land on our site and then enroll. But with the last touch model, the way we saw it, or the way we read it, was just understanding that they came from that last touch, which would have been display, before that enrollment, right? And then you get into enrollment journey and then enroll. Unfortunately, the other touch points within the journey did not get the credits that they needed. And so what we decided to do was take a step back, develop a plan or methodology that would help us truly understand where the customer is coming from by channel, what the impact is along that journey, and then what that eventual conversion is, so that we're able to truly understand which points of touches that we need to invest into the most. All right, so we built it without cookies, and this was a very daring undertaking, right? And so what I'm going to talk about right now is just the 3 big points, or the 3 big factors that we use in developing this, right? So first are the IP addresses, and IP addresses we get on multiple ways, right? One of the ways that we get it is with the assumption that the person has purchased a printer, they do end up setting the printer up electronically. With that, we capture IP addresses, right? So that's something that you guys are very familiar with. The next thing is the jump ID, which is more where the bread and butter of what our plan is based on. And basically what a jump ID is a unique identifier, very similar to a UTM is what that jump ID is, right? So we append that onto the URLs by channel, by tactic. You can go to an audience level as specific as you want it. And so as the people come from wherever they are within the Mediaverse onto our site, we're able to capture them uniquely and identify them, connect those to the IP addresses as well, right? And then during that enrollment process, there's also a submission of email, whether you are setting up your printer or you're enrolling for that Instant Ink program, you do submit your email. And so with these touch points or with these factors, we're able to connect and form unique IDs per user as they come through the journey. So tracking this is kind of fundamental to what we're able to build within the MTA, right? So as we see that with a jump ID combination to the IP address to the email, we're able to understand which media channel drove what at what time to drive them to the site within our attribution window to be able to then capture that enrollment. So over here, I'm going to give you a more linear representation of that journey, right? And so we're going to use Keith. I hope no one in the room is called Keith, but if you are, you're the example. So there's a couple of assumptions here. they've already purchased the printer, right? Because there's an exposure to the printer. And since we focus on instant ink, it assumes that you already do own the printer. So based on that printer ownership, we detect that there is a need for ink, right? So then we send out that display ad. In this case, we chose a social ad. And that would act as the first touch. And then based on the journey to our page, we retarget them with an email. And then it could also be a display ad, right? So these touch points are just as examples, but the different medias can be different, right? So in this case, we use an email. They come onto the site, and then the curiosity drives them into that last touch to then enroll through the smart app, right? Previously, what we saw, or what the attribution gave us, was the smart app drove that enrollment. But with the jump ID and IP address tracking, that combination, we're able to use and understand that the Facebook jump ID was what led to the first exposure, right, within that MT attribution window. In this case, we use about 90 days, and we play with it quite a bit. But let's assume 90 days, that Facebook was the first exposure, and that's what brought them to the site, right? So then we notch that. Then, based on the email send and an email open and then a read traffic back to the site, we're able to notch that email was that second touch point, right? And then that combination identifies Keith as that unique user, brings him back to the smart app if he wants to enroll there, or he chooses to enroll on our site, and then that enrollment gets captured, and then we take credit for that, right? Does that kind of highlight what the journey looks like? Yeah, so that's what we have tried to build, and we're still trying to flash. It's a work in progress, but we've seen a lot of success with it, right? So now, before we implemented this plan, marketing attribution was just about 2%, because a lot of the attribution was going to the last touching point, which would be the smart app. But since the implementation of this plan, we've gone up to about 40% and climbing in terms of attribution towards that enrollment. Right, so then on the side, you'd see a little chart. Let me explain that a little bit. So what that is showing us, and we can really ignore that one touch, right? So what we've learned, right, at the average number of touches that it takes for someone to then enroll. And this is the big learning here for us, and that's kind of the big takeaway for us is how many touches does it take to get there? What are we going to invest? Where are we going to invest? And what are we going to double down on? Also helps us understand what are the hurdles. After a particular number of exposures, do we then just move on to the next person, right? Where's the bulk of that enrollment occurring? So that one touch really highlights affiliate, low-hanging fruit. Affiliate marketing, they go on there, they're ready to go, they go, right? So that's great, we know that. Now that's also helpful for us in that we understand that a lot of it's coming from there. Now what's even more important to us are the 2 to 3 and then 4 to 7. Basically that added incrementality is the value that we're looking for, and that's where we start to find that out with this MTA model. Right, and then you can see that's also more than 7, which it's a little lower, but still valuable towards the overall goal that we have. Okay, so what were the results? In this particular model that we've built, we've seen a 7x increase over time within the window of attributed conversions for particular channels, right? So Facebook, specifically on our social journey, we did see a 7x increase in attributed enrollment, whereas in the past we were blind to that because of that last touch model. Right. So with what we're doing and with our programmatic media especially suffers quite a bit because usually it's not the last touching point within the journey. And so that attribution is fair, it does not get given to that programmatic channel. But with this increase, we're starting to then see it across the board with our different media channels, especially on social and programmatic, and then leaving out what was our smart app and our affiliate marketing. All right, so as I said, we're still developing this plan, right? And what does the future look like as we're putting this together? There are a couple of talking points, right, and a couple of hurdles that we've ran into. The first of which is view-through data. Now, most of the model is click-based, so we do miss out on anything that came through a view-through premise, right? So the view-through data, we've not been able to capture that. We're not able to truly understand the impact there because it's click-based. So if we do invest on anything video, YouTube, CTV, unfortunately, that's not captured in the MTA model that we have, right? Now, the next thing is regulations. As I mentioned before, we have IP addresses. In the near future, given what it's looking like, and this is just my best guess, my POV, I think IP addresses are going to start getting regulated in one way or another, right? Privacy is becoming an increasing concern across the board, as it should be, right? So there is a chance that's going to go away. What are we going to do, and what are we going to replace it with, That's a concern that we need to address before we get to that point. Then third is we're starting to play with a regression model to continue to understand what along the journey is driving it, what are the key touch points within the journey, and within those key touch points, where are we looking to, again, invest, double down on, and increase our incrementality at the end of the day. And with that, I am at the end of the presentation. Thank you very much for having me.
Roland, thank you. Think up some questions for Roland. Here, grab a mic. So first of all, are you organizing this through a CDP? And tell us how you're doing this on the back end, because HP's got a huge amount of data along a lot of different channels. So which data are you using and how are you organizing it on the back end?
Yeah, so our data analytics team is actually very, very intelligent, and they are putting this together for us on the back end. We are organizing it on the back end. We primarily rely on Adobe Analytics to kind of construct it, right? So with part of that unique identifiers that we actually develop are based on MCIDs, right? So based on that MCIDs, we're able to create those unique individuals, those unique profiles, and be able to track their journeys across the web. And then when they get into our ecosystem, we take it from there and then consolidate it and then report back on it.
You're also, by the way, I should mention, I'm not sure that recall that you mentioned it, but I know we've talked about it. You also use a lot of inbox promotion, right?
Yes, yes.
And so you're working with offline as well,
correct,
with offline channels as well.
Correct.
Tell us a little bit about how you're incorporating that and what the role of sort of the inbox promotion is, and maybe explain what that is.
Yes, okay. So we call it an UBI, a fancy acronym for out-of-the-box enrollment, right? And that's with our hardware advertising. So once the person purchases a printer, we do have a promotion in there that automatically enrolls them into Instant Ink, right? And that's the Instant Ink product. We're trying to focus on ink product, but before you can use the ink, you need a printer. So once they enroll in the ink, we're able to capture them again with that email enrollment, with that IP address from the printer, and then they are in the program, right? So with that first 3 months of free offering, the person gets to essentially trial what Instant Ink is. And if they love it, they come back and then fully enroll and then start paying it, right? Think about it as Netflix. Pay for your first 7 days for free, or watch the 7 days for free, and then you get enrolled in there and continue to use it, right? So we're kind of using that same subscription model of having them try it out, then.
But how effective, just as sort of as a tip for everybody, because this is a channel that I've heard a lot of, especially during the pandemic. And we just did a D2C show where it's one of the channels where a lot of the D2Cs are finding a lot of impact, is having that physical, tangible thing offline. Partnering with a lot of companies, a lot of the D2Cs are partnering with each other to sort of pack in a lot of these hard promos. So tell us a little bit about how those performed for you.
They've been very, very effective. So we do quantify audiences into 2 categories, right? Which is within a certain time window. So it's up to 14 days of exposure or of activation of the printer, and then from the 14 days to 30 days of activation, right? So once they use it for the first 14 days, they've activated it, they've used the Instant Ink. How quick are they to then actually enroll into the program and start paying for it? We do see an incrementality with that first 14 days versus the second period of time, right? So it's become very, very effective in that they do use it once upon enrollment or upon activation, enjoy the product enough that they then buy into it. So it's been very, very effective.
Let's talk about some of the social channels, because you highlighted Facebook especially. What were some, you mentioned that you got some good results from optimizing the social channels. So tell us some of the things you learned about what kinds of optimizations worked and how you were pulling which levers in the social channels.
Absolutely, that's a great question. So through the social activations, we came to understand, one of the key things that we came to understand were in that enrollment journey, in that customer touchpoint journey, where do we see the most drop off? Right? As we're counting the numbers that are coming in from our media channels into our ecosystem, where do we see the most drop-off? Is there a particular partner or a particular channel where the drop-off is occurring, right? So we did see that social was one of the points of that drop-off within the enrollment channel, within the enrollment journey. So what we're able to do was, is it a message confusion? Is it a creative confusion? Is it content? Is it not what they expect when they come in from that channel into the enrollment journey? Right? And then within that, how do we optimize that? Do we then bring a lot of people to that point, hoping if we maintain a conversion rate, they end up enrolling? or we bring more qualified audiences, that journey is a lot smoother, right? So then we started playing a little bit with what step in the journey do we want to optimize to, essentially, what our messaging should be up onto that step. So do we talk about pricing? Do we talk about the benefits? Do we talk about your savings, right? And then, double back on that in the messaging at the forefront from the first touch, second touch, whatever point that is, and then start to drive the people back there, right? So with that, we did see improvement quite a bit.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because, in many ways, it's sort of the same problem that publishers found for years when they were using Facebook as a traffic driver, is that it was a lot of traffic, but it was shallow traffic.
Yes.
And
yes.
and so they really couldn't do much with it once they got it.
Exactly.
And it was sort of like professional clickers or something
Yes.
who were coming from the social channels. I wanted to ask another question about social. Since you were doing this during a period, or you have been doing it during a period when, for a lot of different segments within Facebook's platform, prices have been going up incredibly. In fact, just again, I reference our D2C show where those guys have seen some doubling and tripling of CPMs just over the course of the last 2 years. What was your experience, and did that change the plan at all?
It did. It got more, CPMs got more expensive. I mean, the world has gotten very expensive over the last couple of years now. But it did, right? Because what we optimize to, and our KPI at the end of the day, is a CPE, a cost per enrollment, right? So it's revenue-based, right? So we have to back into that. Facebook, a lot of our purchases also is, our purchase model is very CPM-based, right? And that's why the value of what we did was in the quality of the audiences that we're bringing. If we keep spending a lot of money and bringing them in, and they're just shallow audiences, we're losing, right? And that's why we wanted to provide that qualification ahead of time and bring the more qualified audiences based on, the lever you asked about that we're pulling. Bring the more qualified audiences in from the onset, rather than just dump it all on there and hope they eventually enroll. We try to identify who our most efficient CPMs for qualified audiences are, right? So not only are the audiences qualified, but we're getting efficient CPMs before bringing them onto the site, and then they start that enrollment process, and hopefully that stickiness carries through to the end of the journey.
So how did you mentioned that one of the things you were able to prove here is getting away from last click attribution. Is you were able to move attention away from simply the app being seen as the principal driver of business here to a more general marketing mix. But then how did that impact your overall allocation mix? What changes, how did it affect the marketing spend and then the allocation across the different channels?
Yeah, so that's great. And that was probably our biggest success right there, right? Because what we wanted to do was understand the impact of our performance media. Based on the last click, at 2%, as a decision maker, you're not going to invest in a channel that's only giving you 2% versus another channel that might be attributed or that might be getting that other 98%, right? So what that helped us understand were there are key channels along the journey that play a role. And that's where the regression modeling is going to come in as we develop that, right? But we've been able to understand there are key channels that play a role towards that incrementality that we see. Right, so not just the low-hanging fruit, but with these key channels, how can we double down on that? Right, so rather than say, okay, Facebook is not working because from the last touch concept, we don't see a lot of enrollment, we then start to invest heavily in Facebook. Display also, we start to invest heavily in display. When we compare the display CTRs, for example, what tends to be some of the KPIs that we use, they're rather low than other social channels might be, right? But then when we see the role that it plays in the journey as such an effective second touch, it gives us more confidence in being able to invest a little more into display or programmatic in that respect.
How were you going outside of Facebook into other social channels? Were you experimenting with new channels, especially made to avoid some of the pricing in Facebook, but also to explore, get beyond that, whatever audience Facebook really seems to lock in?
Yes, we did. We do a plethora of the social environment to the social channels. I call on Facebook specifically because that's where we saw the biggest increase. That 7x increase came directly from Facebook, but we did explore quite a few other channels that also contributed to the incrementality that we saw. So yes, we did explore a couple of different channels. We've explored YouTube, we've explored Snapchat, Pinterest, all those big partners out there.
So once you start building this MTA model, or at least preliminarily, does it impact then, are there some channels that you lean into or lean back of, mainly because they play well into your MTA model, that they're simply more measurable and more accountable, and you feel more confident about them, and then other channels that you'll lean back on because they may work, but they're not fitting well within the MTA model?
Yes, and that's been a big hurdle for us, right? So yes, that has happened. There've been channels that we've had to lean away from, and not confident as much as comfort, right? Because when it comes down to it, is how comfortable do we feel in investing in that, knowing that it's a big black box, knowing that it probably plays a role, but we don't know what role it plays. And a lot of that has been our view-based channels, right? So I'm looking at CTV, and I'm looking at YouTube especially, right? Because we look at YouTube as part of that Google environment, and so we do see that it has value. But unfortunately, because our model is click-based, we don't see the effective value or its contribution to it, unless we use methodologies such as brand lift studies or search lift studies or conversion lift studies, right? And all that's good, but it's not the primary KPI that we're focused on. So unfortunately, we started to back away from that, right? And that's why it's on the roadmap. It's one of the big things that we want to be able to unearth is how do we add in view through attribution into that MTA model. We want to go away from just relying on click-based, knowing that there's value in the video, right? We do see some value in the video because what we've tested over time has been to say turn off our video-based channels, right? So let's say we turn off YouTube. Do we see a drop in the enrollment level? Do we see a drop in the traffic levels? Do we see a drop in that? And yes, we do, right? So an introduction of CTV, right? And this was an accidental test that we stumbled upon, right? But we were a little late to launch CTV last year. What we did see was upon launching CTV, there was a rise in the number of enrollments overall, right? So we maintained a steady level with what we did with our MTA model over the first 6 weeks of the campaign. Now with the launch of CTV, we saw an exponential rise in the number of enrollments, the number of traffic, and ultimately our CPE started going down, which was great for us, right? So that in itself told us there's value there, and so it gives us a key point to then go investigate. View through is going to be important, right? Video is important, CTV is important, YouTube is important. How do we measure that? How do we make that a part of it? How do we actually put numbers to it rather than using situational factors to determine its worth?
And ultimately, you want to get that sort of that branding effect into the MTA model.
Correct. It has to trickle down. How does that brand affect that trickle down in the conversion process?
You've not mentioned the term, and maybe nobody will mention the term. Maybe this is an important point to underscore. You haven't said walled garden.
Yes.
Does it matter? Well, is the walled garden impact, which is all we heard a year or two ago, certainly pre-pandemic, does it matter to this model at all? Or do you?
So, opinion moment, not fact-based. I've had that conversation with a couple of people out here. I think the walled garden has value, right? So the walled garden, Google walled garden, whatever it is, Amazon, it has value. Where it falls short is its incrementality. Right? So even with our affiliate marketing and all that, we do see that, yes. I see the walled garden as low-hanging fruit. They know what they do. They have all the information about the audiences. They have all the levers to pull, but then it's also restricted within that walled garden. Within that walled garden, you're limited to everything outside it. And I believe everything outside is a bigger audience, the bigger opportunities there, right? So yes, walled garden has this role, and we're able to see stuff like that, but then we're limited and we get stuck when we try to incrementally try to drive our CPs down and gain that incrementality over time. If we limit ourselves to the walled garden, I think we fall short of a bigger potential earning that we may gain on the back end.
Well, incrementality is sort of our buzzword now. And tell me a little bit about how you connect your MTA model with incremental value being driven by the other media.
Okay, so the primary way that we do that is with our attribution window. Right. So over the attribution window, we do know that this instant ink product, for example, is not a see it and buy kind of thing. There's an enrollment process involved. As we started to understand the multiple touches that are involved in that, right? As we limit the window, and that's kind of what we're also playing with. As we limit the window, we do see that incremental value drop. As we open up the window, we see it rise, right? So maybe someone's journey may not be in that same day or that same session enrollment. Unfortunately, not that kind of product. But with the window flexibility, we do see that incremental value rise, right? So as I showed with the graph, over time, with the measured attribution, we do see an exponential rise on that incrementality, right? So we do see value in that. What we don't want to do, though, and want to be careful of is, if you leave the window wide open, then it's going to look good over time, and it's just going to keep looking good, right? So we also have to limit it at some point and just capture that window. Hence, starting at the 90-day window, hopefully we can bring it back a little bit with an element of predictability as to what to expect once we go in market.
Which part of that roadmap is going to be the hardest to pull off or the biggest challenge?
That's a great question. Okay, so those three: view through, regulation,
view through, regulation, and
regression.
And regression.
Which is going to be the hardest. What I'm most excited about is view through. Answer like a politician. What I'm most excited about is view through. I think that's going to give us the facts that we need and the solid numbers that we need to measure what we're doing and understand what our investment is bringing us. What is going to be most difficult, I think, is a regression model. I think that's going to keep moving around. It's going to be hard to really capture it, right? Because I think it's ever evolving, ever changing. So it's going to be kind of difficult. As soon as you feel that we've captured it, I think it's going to keep just moving around. It's going to be a moving target quite a bit, right? So there might be an element of flexibility needed there. As much as we want it to be a fixed model, I think there's going to be an element of flexibility needed there, right? So I think that's going to be the hardest, and that's probably going to take the most time.
Let me ask you, let me end on a politics question. Please get ready with your questions. How do you sell this internally? Attribution modeling, traditionally, is stepping on somebody's toes. You're moving money around.
Yes.
You're taking something from, I'm imagining some of the app guys were not happy with this. So tell me a little bit about how this works internally when you're bringing attribution models into the group that really are going to rearrange the way things are done.
That's great. And I hope my director's not watching me. So it's exciting. First of all, I should say it's really exciting only because we're better able to understand, and I think that's the joy it brings to our key stakeholders, our CMO and all that, the joys of understanding the impact that marketing is driving, right? That's the first and foremost thing is we were missing what the value of marketing was, right? So that's been the most exciting part. Now, the honest part of it is if one is working and the other is not working, you know, naturally, with the number crunches, that's where we move the money. And that's why it's critical for us to truly understand the impact that each and every single channel is driving. And if there's a limitation, give it a fair chance to understand. And that's where, you know, as we stumbled upon the CTV, as we talked about, came to understand that video does have an impact. We can showcase it. Now let's work on measuring it, right? So ultimately, truly opens up opportunities for us to be able to dig into certain areas, to dig into, in this case, YouTube or CTV or what it might be, to see how we can start to measure that impact that it drives. Because now we know fundamentally that it does, right? From a case study level that it does. Now it gives us the opportunity to challenge them to say, hey, help us help you. Right? We're taking it away from it because we're not able to prove it. We can only take your word for it so much. But when I go in front of my CMO asking for more money to invest and showing my plans to invest, the obvious question is going to be, who's driving the most CPE? Let's push our money there, right? So helping us help them, or them helping us help them, to be able to truly understand and measure the impact that they're able to drive for us.
Good political answer. Good. We have time for questions. You have any questions? If you have questions, please raise your hand. Tell us who you are and who you're with so we get to know you.
Hi, I'm Shreya. I'm from Empower Media Marketing. I have a question on the view-through. You said you scaled back on some of the view-through channels. Did you see an impact in performance once that happened, once you scaled back on the media spends for those view-through channels?
Yes, we did. In our Q1, we scaled back on a couple of the view-through channels. The impact that we saw was a slowdown in the exponential growth, right? So we started going more towards, we started leveling out in our growth, right? So it led to a reintroduction in Q2, right? So we pulled out of it for a moment and then noticed that drop, right? It didn't flatline, but then the growth slowed down quite a bit. The reintroduction brought the growth back up again.
And were there like multiple channels that you then decided to like scale one back to see which of those channels are making the most impact on performance? Or was it just like all channels that were viewed through, you scaled them back together?
So there were particular channels that were looked at, right, based on our investment level, based on how many opportunities we can open with that investment level. Is that impact that we're going to see, right? So from understanding what we saw before, if we're able to understand investment level and pull back on that, is that going to lead to a more significant drop, right? So it was one at a time rather than just the entire group of view-through channels.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, good morning. Thank you. I'm Jeremy. I'm the head of ad revenue for Sports Illustrated and The Street and a number of others. So we're actually a publishing company. So thank you for the context on attribution. Attribution into media mix allocation was really helpful. What are you seeing as with first-party data and the effort to acquire more first-party data, right? Getting consumers into your funnel. With what's happening in the ecosystem and the media channels that you rely upon most, are you guys like modifying the way that you go about storing or structuring that data? And what evolution are you going through to ensure, because you spoke a lot about the attribution and the media mix, but not as much addressability at scale. So how do you think about addressability of media parallel to what you described? And is that something that you guys are evolving in a meaningful way, or are you still staying sort of focusing more on attribution?
So the focus right now is attribution, but that's a great question. I think it ties back to the conversation about award gardens, right? When we remain within that, we know their data to them is the first party, and we're able to use that and lean on that. Now, that limits our scalability within that, right? So yes, we are looking for opportunities to be able to find and or build out our audiences a lot better, right? Because if we can drive a lot more people into the funnel and then we capture them, then we start to build our own first-party data, right? So where are we going to find those people and bring them in? It is a point for concern, and that's something that we need to focus on. But I think that's where not getting too caught up in the walled gardens is going to help us, because there's a lot more out there than the walled gardens. The thing about the walled gardens, we know what they can do, we see what they can do, we can measure what they can do, so there's not a lot of excitement there, right? It's very predictable. If I need to turn everything on right now and hit this number, invest in that and then do it. But then I get capped when it comes to a quantitative aspect of it, right? So it's a great question, and that's something that we continue to investigate. We haven't unlocked it yet, but that's what the opportunity exists for us outside those walled gardens, is how can we bring more into the funnel and try to grow and develop those first-party media audiences.
Roland, thank you so much.
Thank you as well.
Great job. Thanks so much.